You know, back when I was in the academy, we would follow every toast with a song.
Hi everyone, welcome to Where No Bugs Has Gone Before, a Star Trek The Next Generation podcast hosted by myself, Jay Record, and my father, Jake Record. We're recording this for my son and Jake's grandson, Ben the Bear, for his future enjoyment, but because we know so many people love Star Trek The Next Generation, we're putting all these podcasts out for free on YouTube. How are you doing tonight, Jake?
I'm good, and you, Jay?
I'm doing great. I'm very excited about this episode.
Yes.
Tonight we are looking at and discussing Home Soil, which is Season 1, Episode 17, which debuted February 2nd, 1988.
22nd. 22nd.
Sorry, 22nd.
Yes.
I love this episode for multiple reasons. I think it's one of the first really good First Contact episodes. We're going to have a really interesting conversation about life tonight.
Mm-hmm.
And the definition of it.
Mm-hmm.
But before we get started, I just wanted to ask, what are your general thoughts of the episode in terms of where it is in the season, just the quality of it? You know, what do you think of the show, the episode as an episode itself?
I think it is interesting because it brings in. It's a first contact theme, particularly a first contact with a new life form, an inorganic life form.
Mm-hmm.
At one point, Dr. Crusher gives a mini lecture on exobiology when she describes the criteria for defining life, and also talks about the scientific method a little bit for those viewers who aren't scientists and don't understand the scientific method. It introduces the concept of terraforming. I think this might be the first time in Next Generation, in this first season, that is brought up. And that's something that's really considered. If humans from this planet colonize Mars
or the moon,
or the moon, there's been discussion about how could you make that environment more Earth-like so that humans could live there. Obviously, the environment is not going to be the same it is on Earth because the gravity is going to be different. But I think it just brings, that whole idea of what human colonists would have to do to adapt to living on a different world.
Mm-hmm. I agree. I think there is a lot of interesting discussions about maybe the constraints of science as it currently stands, and how sometimes when we meet something we have to re-examine and kind of redefine some of the definitions we've been used to for a long time. Mm-hmm. And I think like you say, the scientific method is really discussed here as a point of inquiry that not only allows us to review the things we know, but also expand our knowledge and kind of help us redefine things. I think that's really the best part of the scientific method. It's always there to let us re-examine the facts and make changes to them without really altering truth in a fundamentally dangerous way. I think that's the really great part about the scientific method. It's just cold, hard facts sometimes based on the data and the results.
Yes.
So before we get started, let's give the audience at home a little bit of a summary.
Sure, go ahead.
So the U.S. Enterprise-D is on a mission to catalog young planets in the Pleiades cluster. Along the way, they are ordered by the Federation to check on a terraforming colony on Valera 3, since they are supposedly behind schedule. Captain Picard calls down to the station and initially receives no answer from the planet until the director, Kurt Mandel, finally responds. Um, Counselor Troy immediately senses something's wrong when the director insists that there's no need for the Enterprise crew to pay them a visit as they're on a very tight schedule. And his nervousness gives him away so much that Picard insists that an away team be sent down to have a look, which includes Troy, Commander Riker, Lieutenant Yard, Data, and LaForge. When they get down there, they're given a tour of this terraforming facility by a hydraulic specialist named Arthur Malenkon, a biosphere designer named Louisa Kim, and a chief engineer named Bjorn Benson. And of course, the director, Kurt Mandel, is there. And everything is going fine. They're explaining what terraforming is and how it works. Essentially, what happens is Valera 3 has been chosen because it is a supposedly dead planet that contains no life, but has the possibility of creating new life through the process of terraforming, which is basically kind of from the way they explain it. It seems like they are trying to convert this lifeless planet into a Class M environment by basically reseeding the soil of the planet and altering it to make it, I guess, produce life that wasn't there beforehand. That's terraforming is really kind of a science fiction idea still in many ways, but as you previously mentioned, it's one of the things that if we were to successfully colonize the moon, which we call Luna, or a planet like Mars, terraforming would be a required act. But during this demonstration, uh, Kurt Mandel sends Arthur Malenkon into the laser drilling room to continue the work, where he is ultimately murdered by the laser drilling device, and our mystery begins. So, to get started, let's I think that there is something very interesting to talk about when it comes to terraforming and world building in a sci-fi space, especially like Star Trek. Um, so, we've had previous conversations about colonization, and we've had previous conversations about, going out and exploring the stars and what that would mean for humans. But I think the idea of actually turning a dead, lifeless planet is not only, you know, a, a scientific miracle if it's able to be performed, because essentially we're playing God at that point. We're able to do things on a godlike scale. But at the same time, it says something interesting about the Federation from maybe a strategic and maybe a long term view. That they, exploring the galaxy, they're always looking for new life and civilization. But there's also kind of and you see this later on DS9 when they have to deal with the Maquis, because to backtrack for the audience at home, in DS9, the Maquis are a separatist group that is broken off from the Federation because the Federation reached a treaty with the Cardassians during the previous war, and planets that were previously settled by the Federation were essentially given back to the Cardassians. And the people that were on those planets were forcibly removed by the Federation, and they became the Maquis, who, depending on how you look at it, are either terrorists or freedom fighters. But the point I'm trying to bring up here is that it seems interesting to me that the Federation is exploring this because in a post-scarcity society, would you really need to go out of your way to do something this arduous and this strenuous when you don't need to? I understand from a scientific perspective, from an exploratory perspective, from a developmental perspective, why you would want to terraform. But from a world building perspective, if you're in a post scarcity society, do you really need to create more planets for people? Because you're going to have to supply those people with resources. And if you already have infinite resources, why another planet? Is it purely for curiosity? Is it purely for the adventure of it? Which, is fine. A lot of scientific progress is done because purely for the curiosity and wanting to know. But I think from a world building perspective, terraforming is very interesting because it would have real geopolitical or intergalactic political ramifications if the Federation was able to reseed planets. And they've already tried this in the past. Like, this is what the Genesis bomb was essentially.
Sure. Yes.
So the Federation's been terraforming, or at least trying to successfully terraform for at least the last 100 years when we get to this episode.
Well, maybe what's going on is that they're just reflecting what's thought to be what they're presenting is the colonization is almost a human trait.
Yeah, almost. And
And because the other thing is, you never hear in Next Generation or Star Trek that you have other species that are going out. I can't think of any other places where other species are going out and actually colonizing. There's territorial issues like with the Cardassians and the Romulans and early on with the Klingons and so on. But I don't remember any of those people going out. And I mean, the only other race or species that is colonizing, you think about it, is really the Borg.
yes, I was about to say the Borg. No, you're absolutely right. I think the difficult thing about talking about colonization when it comes to today in 2021 is that it's such a fraught term. Because on one hand, our especially here in America, our history has been built on the pride of our colonial roots and tradition. In many ways, our colonial roots have been used to define America's character from the beginning. The fact that we are rugged, that we go out and we explore, and that we settle and we build. But at the same time, we're having this conversation about colonialism in terms of going into places and radically changing cultures, radically changing social and ethical mores, and somewhat undignifying the native populations there in terms of telling them your cultural and ethical mores are outdated compared to ours, and because we're taking you over, you're now going to follow our cultural and ethical mores. I think that's the common criticism of colonization that we hear today. The interesting thing is that, is it really colonization if you're terraforming a dead world with the idea of settling on it if there's no one there? Because originally they assumed that no one's there on Valera 3. Is it necessary if it's in Federation space? Is it colonization, or is it just utilizing the resources that maybe you already have and aren't using?
I think you could define it as colonization because if you have one group that wants to, go live in another area, it could be, those scenarios could be different where like what happened here is that the Europeans go to the New World, they colonize it, they, had to mix with indigenous cultures or suppress indigenous cultures, whereby you could have colonization where you could go to, um, an uninhabited planet and uninhabited world because it's hard to imagine, as you said, if there is not a situation of scarcity, and if in the future population is better controlled and so forth, unless you have some sort of disaster or pandemic that wipes out a large percentage of a certain group.
Mm-hmm.
Um, why would you need to really, go and colonize new worlds and so on?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think again, what's being presented here is just humans need to explore. I mean, it goes back to what we kind of talked about, that if there were as few as 6,000 humans, um, non-modern humans back 40,000 years ago, 50,000 years ago in the Horn of Africa, if they had just stayed there, would have they survived versus them having this nature toward wanderlust and so on? I mean, some of them stayed in Africa, obviously, but enough of them crossed the Red Sea, got into into Southwest Asia, and we pretty much know from archaeological history that they spread out over the land part of the globe from there.
Mm-hmm.
So it just seems like there's this, with our intellectual curiosity, which was very important to human survival, that perhaps is just a driving force in terms of going to new places. And that fits in with, colonizing new areas, whether it's inhabited or not.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think home soil presents a very interesting view of kind of. I want to verbalize this correctly. I think home soil presents I think you're right. Home soil presents colonization as a good thing, but I think this episode also explores the unintended consequences if you're not careful about it, or if you simply don't know and you're ignorant about
Right.
something.
Right.
But let's get into what really causes this this debate during the episode. So after Malankon is killed by the laser control, the crew immediately decides to shut down the terraforming facility and investigate. And they have this really fantastic scene where Data goes in and he starts up the laser drill again. And unexpectedly, the laser drill turns on him, and this really great scene tries to kill Data. And we don't actually see the battle between Data and the laser drill, but it's reported to us because we hear blasts, and Geordi and Bjorn are struggling to get the door open. And when they finally open it, Data walks out and he's like, I'm okay, sir. And it turns out and Margot and I actually watched this episode a few days ago, and we were speculating like how he did it. At some point, Data had to have leapt into the air and grabbed this thing and ripped it out of the ceiling because
Yes.
he's superhuman compared to us.
I had the same thought that he did physical violence against the laser.
Oh yeah, he had to have done something like serious, and then
Right.
But it explains like why they necessarily couldn't shoot that. That would have been a very tough scene.
Right.
But when they get up, when they bring Malkin's body back to the Enterprise and they bring the rest of the terraformers back to the Enterprise, they discover that there was no. Initially, they suspect that there's a murder going on involving Mandel because he's been nervous the entire time. And this gets to where Picard makes a comment to Riker about becoming real detectives when this case really kicks off. And he kind of mentions back to Dixon Hill a little bit. So there is this kind of, and I think you somewhat see it in every episode, somewhat structured like this in Star Trek. A lot of these science fiction episodes, I think, are structured as mysteries. Because you start off with the idea that, okay, something's gone wrong. We don't know what's going on. We have to figure it out. And through that process of discovery and unraveling the mystery, they discover that the laser drill was actually taken over by an inorganic life form that is living within a layer of soil on Valera 3 between, I think it's the topsoil, and I think they said it was the topsoil, and I think the water table.
There's a very thin layer of material that's basically has a lot of salt water in it.
Yeah, they're in a saline medium.
Right.
Or something.
Exactly.
You made some really good notes here about the inorganic life form. So let's run down some things. It's made of silicons and other elements. It's crystalline. It's similar to semiconductor and battery materials. Um, oh, that's right. It was found in a salt layer in the salt content in a layer of water. Um, Apparently, it has increased conductivity in the salt water that allows it to form a larger mind and communicate with the larger species that this organic life form is a part of. Because we have to remember in this episode, the organic life form is never given an actual name until towards the end of the episode, and we'll get into that because that's a really interesting conversation. Um, but this really gets into the question of and what the Enterprise is immediately confronted with when they bring this life form back to the ship is that it is an actual life form. It isn't just sentient; it's intelligent as well. And the entire episode basically revolves around how do we deal with this new form of life while at the same time trying to placate it because it clearly has violent intentions against humans, which we later discover is because of the actual terraforming process itself. Was the terraformers were unknowingly killing this inorganic species by extracting the water
Right,
out of the water table.
right. It was specifically they were taking the water out of the ground and it was taking water out of the salt layer. So it was apparently, discombobulating the chemistry in that saltwater layer in which these organisms lived.
Well, you made a note here that these life forms are in a sense colonial because in that salt water, it allows them to have a conductivity because one of the things is that this life form is photoelectric, which means it
Mm-hmm.
converts things into electricity. Um,
Well, it's interesting that
yeah,
it was when they had it on the Enterprise, they figured that at one point when they were at war with it, or that the organism had declared war against the Enterprise, against the humans, they figured that if they turned the lights down, perhaps that was part of its energy source. So they did, and they found that it did have a photoelectric effect, which gets back into what the organism was made of. It's very much like, sounded like it's very much like a computer chip because there's silicon, but at one point, Data mentioned that there was germanium and some other rare earth elements that you find in semiconductors. He even refers to transistors at one point. And if you think about it, the organism, they mentioned that it is a colonial organism, that because they lived in this saltwater environment that would provide conductivity between these organisms as, sort of a crystalline form, there was sort of a neural network created. And when you mention that, there's some unusual names that are used for this organism as in addition to what the organism refers to humans, they refer to as a microbrain. The other interesting thing, if you think about it, is if the organism in its natural state exists in this layer in the soil, then it wouldn't have access to light. So photoelectricity is only one source of energy. It seems to me that with the rare earth elements and so forth, and the fact that it exists in salt water, it's almost like a battery. It's like self-generating energy.
Yes.
Which made me think from biology that, what we're taught is that what we were taught is that most life on the earth in the biosphere comes from energy from the sun. Plants, and then animals eat plants, and other animals will consume the flesh of animals and so forth.
The circle of life.
Circle of life. But there have been found there are life forms on Earth that really are independent on energy from the sun, and specifically when they found, I think, mainly in the Pacific Ocean, these volcanic vents where this warm, very hot water comes out of the vents, and they're very mineral laden and so forth. and there has been there's a proliferation of life with these large tube worms
Mm-hmm.
and other organisms, algae and so forth that exist there. And since these are in very deep water where there's no light from the sun and so forth, these life forms or that ecosystem is totally dependent on the energy generated from the heat and the minerals coming out of these volcanic vents. And that kind of segues into some of the speculation of the possibility of life on some of the more complex
Mm-hmm.
moons in Jupiter, such as Europa, and particularly uh, Titan, one of Saturn's moons.
Well, let's talk about Europa for a second, because one of the things that we have determined that is integral to the formation of at least biological life as we know it is the existence of water. You have to have water to kind of supplement biogenesis in a way. You can't have just abiogenesis without water and still have kind of the typical five kingdom species that we know about, animals, birds, reptiles, things like that. Um, I think the really so I kind of had a follow up question to you that I wanted to get to first. Do we say microbrain? Do you think that this organism is one individual within its colony, or are we talking about several different members coming together to form a crystalline kind of intelligence?
It's hard to say since this is science fiction, because
Oh, of course. I just want you to speculate.
I mean we see on the Enterprise that one of the things that the criteria that Dr. Crusher states for defining life is the ability to reproduce.
Mm-hmm.
And once they have the organism contained in that bell jar on the Enterprise, it's found that it does undergo a reproductive cycle. But then, so it implies that there are multiple individuals,
This is exactly
but
what I'm getting at. Yeah.
but then the question is, does it act as a single thinking entity? I can't remember toward the end when
Because they say
communic
microbrains, not they say microbrain, not microbrains.
right,
Like it's singular.
microbrain.
It's singular.
But I'm trying to think when they establish communication through the universal translator with the inorganic organism, does the organism ever say we versus I? I don't specifically remember there.
From what
And
I from what I remember of that dialogue, because that dialogue is very vivid in my mind, um, I don't think it actually uses any identifying pronouns, or I'm sorry, any it just doesn't use any self-identifiers like I or we. It's very accusatory throughout the entire conversation,
right,
like you ugly bags of water are killing
right,
us.
right, yes,
Um, and in turn, like I don't think Picard actually says, he doesn't go into the entire spiel of we're humans. He's immediately stuck in like a diplomatic mode trying to make peace. Um, at the same time, I think it's very interesting that this organism has a very kind of human sense of things in some way, because originally what happens is when the terraformers start extracting the water from this thin layer, um, the organisms first try to signal the terraformers, please don't kill us, please don't do this. They start leaving designs in the sand that the
hmm
terraformers later tell us about. We don't They originally don't understand the signs in the sand, so they start making things malfunction. Well, when the terraformers keep going even though things are malfunctioning, that's when the organism actually turns to like harming and killing um, the terraformers, going to the point of actually declaring war on them verbally. And I think that's very interesting that these creatures have a this creature or creatures have a sense of war, because that's a very distinct kind of, I don't think animals plan to go to war against each other. Like, they hunt each other, they flee from each other. They sometimes live together, go to the same watering hole, but you don't see lions really like planning to go to war with hyenas, or elephants planning to go to war with against other elephants. War is a specifically human trait that, or at least from what we know here on our planet, war is a specifically human trait. So I find it very interesting that this organism basically says we've declared war on you when they start talking. And it is the organism itself, it is this inorganic organism that starts the conversation by accessing the universal translator to tell them, like, we're at war with you ugly bags of water. So I find that interesting that it not only has either it either has a sense of, be it one or many, it has a sense of self-preservation and defense that is very, very human.
Well, and the other interesting thing is that toward the end of the episode, the life form makes the supposition that it is more advanced than humans, and after they resolve the issues and they kind of restore peace, they say to Picard, "Come back after you are less primitive and arrogant, like in 300 years."
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Which is a very
and
specific number.
Yeah, and it's really interesting getting into whether the inorganic life form is a singular form, or multiple individuals. I mean, it really could be. It's just a colonial entity.
Mm-hmm.
Again, the micro brain nomenclature kind of makes some sense in that way. And actually, in some lower forms of invertebrate animals, they are basically colonial animals,
Mm-hmm.
but they act as one organism still.
Mm-hmm.
And the other comment I made about that, when the microbrain, says to Picard, "Come back in 300 years when you're more advanced and less primitive and less arrogant," I made a comment as Q would, if he was hearing, he would love that, because he would say, "Picard, see, I told you, it's not just me telling me you're arrogant and you're primitive. It's another entity as well."
I think Q would. I understand your point. I think the difference here is that the difference between Picard and Cortez is that Cortez keeps going and Picard stops. Do you know what I mean?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Like, Cortez knew that these people knew the Aztecs didn't have the same level of technology he did. He knew that they didn't have resistances to certain diseases, and he knew that they had a large amount of wealth that he could collect from them if he oppressed them. And he still chooses to go through it. Like, Cortez still chooses to attack and oppress the Aztecs. Picard, when realizing his mistake, immediately jumps back. And in many ways, this is the first episode where the Prime Directive is actually held to its highest standard. Because in other episodes, including Justice, Picard will sometimes violate certain elements of the Prime Directive if he thinks it's morally or ethically good, right. This is the one place where, like, he holds the Prime Directive up as, like, this shining thing that is really going to get them out of this.
Well, the difference between Picard and Cortez is that Cortez, when he landed at Veracruz on the Gulf of Mexico, said, "I'm here for God, Spain, and gold."
Right.
And it was actually, he was there for gold. That was the number. That was the driving force. He really wanted to get rich.
Yeah, it's gold, and then maybe Spain. If God works his way in there.
Exactly. I had brought the priest along so they can convert these people. And the king and the queen, are paying for me. So I've got to have some fealty to them and so forth. But, Picard and the Federation, they don't have that commercial, that selfish, even greedy motivation when they're doing this.
Well, it's interesting.
But it gets back to your original supposition, is what's the need to colonize this uninhabited world?
Well, I think in terms of one character, we can from this episode we can use Kurt Mandel is in some ways the example of the negative colonizer versus
I,
Picard.
yeah, I have real questions about him because I'm left with what did he really know and how honest was he? Because he's so, Troy picks up that he's trying to hide something in the beginning. And then he, as they learn more about the organism, he says, oh, it really is something alive we didn't know, and all of this. And then at the end, he, you know, almost pleads forgiveness, like, what have I done, and so forth. And it's just like he's too sly about this. I'm left with, as I'm talking to you about this, I'm thinking that Mandel, knew that he was interfering. There was a good chance he was interfering with the life form, and that the Federation science team that had gone in and declared the planet as being, uh, devoid of life and thus, qualified to be terraformed. I think he had doubts about that, but he was, as you said, he was so much into terraforming and had started the process. He didn't want to stop.
Well,
And
I think
and
it's the
and,
question.
and he's a little bit, he's not Cortez, but I really question how honest he is, even at the end.
Oh yeah. Oh, I think I think you're right. I think there's a clear indication that he knows earlier on than he's saying, including um, earlier on than his fellow terraformers knew.
Oh
And I
yes,
think
for
a lot of
sure.
that and this is just me speculating. Um, I looked up the character profile for Kurt Mandel on Memory Alpha, and
Hmm.
apparently in the show he describes having himself as having advanced degrees in um, computer engineering and artificial intelligence. Now, putting
Right.
the computer engineering one to the side, I think his experience in artificial intelligence is probably what helps him figure out that there's something here.
Hmm.
Because one important conversation that's being had in artificial intelligence is really how do you define intelligence? Like, what does it mean for a creature to be intelligent? How do you measure intelligence in terms of it a being or organisms an organism's ability to affect change in its own environment?
Well, I think a basic question there is, and criteria is the organism self-aware?
Yes. And I think Mandel knows by the signs he sees in the sand with the rest of the terraformers
Mhm.
that they are self aware. But since the rest of them don't have that kind of knowledge of being able to recognize intelligence when it's presenting
Hmm.
itself in the very subtle ways, because
Hmm.
in many cases when it comes to artificial intelligence and artificial general intelligence, which is the big goal that everyone's trying to develop, um, defining intelligence in broad stroke terms is easy, but finding real like to find for us to create an AI that is similar to actual human intelligence would require an understanding of the minute permutations our neurons take in our brain and our decision making and our processes. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Hmm.
And I think Mandel knows those little minute details
Hmm.
that distinguish intelligence from something that's just non-intelligent. And I think you're right. He's probably seeing these he's probably the moment he sees those designs in the sand that the beings use to communicate initially, he probably goes like, "Oh shit, we were wrong." Well, I'm not going to
Hmm.
say anything,
Hmm.
because this is his entire career in life.
Right. Right.
And in some ways, he is like Cortez because it's the quest for glory
Hmm.
in many ways.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that is a good point. Yep.
Um, One thing that I find about the entire, we're talking about director Mandel. Um, I looking at the rest of the team, Malakon's dead very early on the season, so there's very little to talk about with him. But
Me-
with
uh, uh,
Malison,
Mallinson is I. have his name written down.
Right. Yeah, I think you're right. I think it is probably
Yeah.
Mallinson.
Uh-huh.
There's Bjorn, and then there's Louisa Kim,
Right.
and who else survived? I think that's it. Yeah, there were only 4 of them.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's very interesting that putting them next to Mandel, their reactions to finding real life, because Bjorn is a
He was an engineer of
chief
some
engineer,
sort. Yeah.
right? So he keeps all the stuff functioning.
Right.
It actually, if we look at their scientific roles, it's very interesting because the Federation didn't send anyone out there necessarily to recognize if there was any sort of life, because Arthur Mallinson is a hydraulic specialist.
No, they said that
Kim is a
the
biosphere
Federation
designer.
had, before Mallinson or Mandel and his team showed up.
No,
I believe
they cleared the planet. I just find it interesting that you have a scientific team down on the planet.
Mhm.
It doesn't include like an exobiologist or just something of that nature. Just
Well,
in
but
case.
since the Federation had already said that there's no life form here, they didn't need a biologist.
True. I mean, but that gets into your note about one thing that let's see, where is it? Oh yeah. Basically, when Crusher gives her mini lecture on exobiology and the scientific method, one thing that we're made clear is that the Federation certification of plans for terraforming is basically missed these organisms because they didn't fit the parameters.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I think I do agree with you. They obviously didn't have a biologist on there because they didn't think there was a need. But I would think that after all this time and after everything that they've run, like the Federation in terms of their knowledge base, after everything everyone's run into, I think that you would think that they would have I guess assume that there's a possibility that you could have inorganic life.
I don't think they were thinking about this long. You bring a good point, because as they were showing the process of terraforming, they were trying to change the soil so they could introduce some plant life. Because remember, they showed like some satellite pictures of it brown, and they showed how it would become green with some sort of plant life.
Oh, I made
So
a note of that.
it's almost like
in 35 years time too.
Yeah, it's kind of like Mark Watney being on Mars and becoming the best potato farmer on the whole planet.
Basically,
they basically, if they were going to do that, maybe they weren't at that point, but were they going to have to bring in, a botanist, a biologist of that sort to help, yeah, and which is a good question then is, I guess, if they would change the environment of the soil so it could support some plant life, how do they choose what plant life to bring in? Because they had many choices, because there's different planets from which they could bring, different species and types of plants.
Well, so there's 2 things about that. First thing I found interesting about this conversation is, and I made a point of it a minute ago, but just the time scale that they have to complete this. They're projecting that this could get done in 35 years.
Mm-hmm.
That, scientifically speaking, and we're now living in the era of these mRNA vaccines
Mm-hmm.
that, have been developed literally at light speed, comparatively in terms of other vaccines that have been developed through history. 35 years is so short on a cosmic time scale. We talk about how our existence as a human species is really a blink of an eye not even a blink of an eye on the cosmic time scale. Changing a lifeless planet into a planet that's teeming with life in just almost 4 decades is this has to be science fiction, because even in our current science, when we talk about terraforming, like for example, if we wanted to terraform Mars, it would take hundreds of years and multiple generations of settlers on Mars to terraform that planet back into what we originally suspect it was at one point, which was very Earth-like in terms of having a vibrant landmass and a large, vibrant ocean.
Well, there's one thing to think about here. There's this month's issue of National Geographic talks about air pollution
Hmm.
and how it really, puts the Clean Air Act that actually Nixon passed as president back in 1970.
Back when conservatives cared about the environment.
Right. And it was actually, that was 1970 was the first year that they celebrated Earth Day on April
Hmm.
22nd. And one of the things the Nat Geo article talked about is how much the air quality has improved in the United States. And they talked about, Southern California. They talked about Pittsburgh, that back during World War II in the 50s, it just, you couldn't keep, you know, you had to wash sheets once a week because the grime in the air came into your house.
Oh, New
And
York during the 70s and 80s.
and so, and now, so we've cleaned up our air a lot. And now you have places like in India and China, with the number of people there, they have really bad air pollution. Part of the article talked about the capital of Mongolia, Ulaanbaatar, because all
Hmm.
their power is generated from coal, and it is actually one of the most polluted capital cities in terms of air. And the air in New Delhi sometimes gets so bad that you can actually see the brownishness, the particulate matter in the air inside the buildings.
Yes.
So my point is that, if you look at how we've cleaned up the air in the US, um, it took a matter of decades to make a difference. And the other interesting thing, just think about it, is when the pandemic started a year ago, there's data out there that demonstrated, once everybody locked down, there was less travel and so forth, air traffic, automobile traffic, and so forth, that the air quality actually measurably improved in terms of pollutants that come from automobiles and
Hmm.
so on. So, maybe it is possible, if you have the right process, to, you know, do good, to do some sort of terraforming process. However, I think you'd have to have certain, components you'd have to put into this new ecological system that you're building. Like
Oh,
in
yeah.
this case, they're saying that, they're going to turn this arid planet, it's going to start to show some plant life of some sort. So you're going to have to introduce that in, because I think one of the points you're making, you're not going to have natural evolution in a
No.
period of 35 years that all of a sudden plant life is going to grow and
Well,
so on.
let's explore it like this for a second. You know, when we talk about the creation of life and taking it away from the realm of science for a second, culturally, we often go to the Bible and the creation story and how God created the earth and separate the skies from the earth and the water and all that in 7 days. Now, thinking about it, 7 days to God is probably very different for us. And I actually think the Hindus explore this very well in terms of the Hindus actually have these books devoted to each and every one of their gods, and they actually explain what the time scale is for their gods. So, like one yuga for them is like a day, but for us, that could be a billion years for us mortals. So, a
Mhm.
billion years is a day to like the Hindu gods.
Mhm.
But if you're talking about how life arises, let's say there is an intelligent design behind it, because what we're talking about with terraforming is actually intelligent design taking place.
That's a good point. Yes.
Um, you would have to have not only an intelligence that was wide enough and deep enough to include all of the natural elements that you would need to set life
Mhm.
in motion, but you would also have to have kind of a good idea of what you need to keep that life evolving and going, because it's one thing to get a plant started, but to actually keep it growing and keep it living and keep and have it produce offspring in the form of seeds that later fall into the soil itself or are carried
Mhm.
by the wind to different areas to seed those areas. um, you need so much to make life work. And I don't think people understand the complexity of that. And scientifically do, but from an existential perspective, we don't.
Right, right.
I think the problem here with terraforming is that, it's very clear that they're going to bring, the Federation wants to bring humans to Valera 3 once this thing's terraformed.
Mm-hmm.
But what about animal life? What about, you need animals to help keep your soil and your water viable and stable because they have to consume it, and they, through their own waste processes, add things back into the soil. Their carrion will add things to the biosphere. All of these things are needed to make life not only work but continue. My question really does come down to, what does the Federation really have in mind to make life continue after this 35-year project is done? Do do you actually need to have, like, for example, on Earth, Star Trek 4, it seems like there's not much native marine life left in the ocean in Star Trek 4, because when the whale entity shows up looking for humpback whales, it's obvious that all the humpback whales are extinct.
Mm-hmm.
So clearly life on Earth continued without the humpback whales. Do you need animal life? Do you need all of these different things to continue life on a terraformed in-class world? Or is it so designed in a way that you can basically press a button and it goes forever?
No, this comes up to something you said before. You talked about different kingdoms, and you said, plants and animals. And I just went on Google Wikipedia article about kingdoms in biology, and there are different approaches to this because there's one, Aristotle, going back to his time, basically said, and some of this goes into Linnaeus, which was in the 1700s, that there were basically animals, vegetables, and minerals. And then that's basically two kingdoms of life. And then it gets more complex where actually von Leeuwenhoek, which was in the late 1600s, before Linnaeus, talks about protists, which are the microscopic life forms, and then plants and animals. And not to go into it, but there are different systems of looking at this depending on how far you break down, particularly the microorganisms. You can have as many as 8 different kingdoms right there, and there's all kinds of different systems there. The point being that if you look at how life evolved on this planet, the more we study it, the more we develop the concept that there are more than just 3 kingdoms. It's just not plants, animals, and microorganisms or protists, that there are, other intermediary kingdoms where the organisms, fit into a different classification. And I think that brings up that, what you're bringing up is, it's interesting about the animals is, when you terraform, would you just worry about plants and just leave it at that? Or would you bring animals? But if you have plants, are there going to be microorganisms involved in that plants? Are there going to be microorganisms that are essential to the soil? Because, we're learning a lot more now about the relationship between like fungi and plant roots, and even, some of these scientific studies that share that, forest actually could be defined as a living ecosystem, that there are communication between the trees.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
And so on. So we're starting to understand scientifically that certain kingdoms of life or forms of life, even here, are much more complex than we thought. So if you terraform, are you going to have to actually have, to what degree are you going to have the same level of complexity for a new ecosystem to be successful?
Well, bringing it back to the Borg for a moment, I think it's important to remember that in Borg episodes where they discuss what happens if the Borg is successful, when the Borg take over a planet, they actually terraform it,
That's right. Yeah.
and they terraform it so it's suitable for the Borg.
Hmm.
And if you look at it, what they do is that I think they change the atmosphere.
They do. They increase the temperature, or the overall temperature of the atmosphere, and they increase carbon dioxide,
Right.
which is basically what is happening here. Is we're increasing the carbon dioxide content, which is causing, you know, more heat to be retained in the atmosphere.
And if you look at the Borg, going back to our discussion about animals, where would they fit in as an inorganic bio? They are both a combination of biological machinery and
Hmm.
inorganic machinery.
Mm,
Where do they
hmm.
fit in the definition of life then?
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Because
We've kind of touched on that before.
because
Yeah.
their plan is to terraform planets into extremely hostile atmospheres to what we would consider life. But that in some ways that's a form of dumb terraforming, if I can use a simple term. Like they're making it suitable for just them, versus what I think what's happening on Valera 3. Valera 3 seems like very complicated terraforming. Like what's going on here has, and even Mandel says like we can't take our attention away from this. We have to stay on this. We have to always be at this because it's so complex to
Hmm.
create these gardens of Eden, as he says.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, I wonder if there's really a difference between like the idea of, and these are just things I'm saying at home, folks, dumb terraforming and smart terraforming. Because it seems like the Federation is taking part in smart terraforming, the Borg are taking part in dumb terraforming. The question
Hmm.
is, can both work, or can dumb terraforming work because for the Borg, it's just changing the atmosphere and wiping out all other life because they don't need the things we need to survive. It doesn't seem like they eat food. They really don't sleep besides their regeneration cycles. Um, it doesn't really seem like if they're coming to planet Earth, and the idea is the how we know about terraforming is from Star Trek First Contact, where the Enterprise E, which is the later ship after the D, um, actually follows the Borg back in time to the era of Zefram Cochrane when he's about to test the first warp drive, and they discover that the Borg is initially successful because they come upon planet Earth after it's been terraformed. I think I think the difficulty of this conversation when it comes to terraforming is that on one hand it is something totally possible for us to do in the future. I mean, we've as we've discussed previously, there's already scientists studying it for the possible colonization of Mars and, of course, the possible colonization of the Moon. And the reason they think that they can do this is because of the presence of water on both of these planets. Well, the Moon's not a planet, but on both of these celestial bodies, there is water on them, and they believe, but with the presence of water, they would be able to re-terraform the planet into something habitable for humans. Is that all it would take, or is it going to require so much more? Because you getting back to what you asked, like, are they going to bring animals onto this planet in 35 years and just let them loose and kind of populate Valera 3? Like, how is this going to work in the long term?
Yes, we'll just have to speculate as to what a terraforming textbook would look like in the future when they've started to figure this out. Because in some ways, we're very simply doing some terraforming now by trying to, with the whole idea of green energy and so
Mm-hmm.
forth, we're working to restore. Um, I can't say a more normal, because what is normal, but we're trying to, reverse the effects of,
Wow,
um,
I never thought about it that way.
yeah,
Well, for a second, like,
we're trying to we have evidence that result of human activity
Mm-hmm.
that we're warming the climate, which is going to cause um, ecological, geopolitical uh,
Human
problems.
devastation. Just human
Devastation.
devastation.
It might have some benefits too, in terms of shifting of agricultural zones. It,
Depending where
it'll,
you
it,
are.
well, it'll, in some cases, it'll make some places where agriculture is flourishing now less so. In places where agriculture doesn't exist, it will improve it, such as, the southern parts of taiga
Mm-hmm.
and tundra and so on, in particularly in Asia and Russia at this point.
Mm-hmm.
But what we're trying to do is sort of put things, um, trying to reverse what human habitation has done, so that the adverse effect that we're going to see. I mean, even sea level rise, bring that into effect. We're trying to control that. So it is a form of terraforming in a way, that what we're doing now. But you could make the whole thing about when we build an intrastate highway system.
Mm-hmm. Very true.
That's terraforming. When we build a dam, that's terraforming.
I think the interesting thing that you brought up is that, in many ways, we are reviving these dead planets. Because at one point, like, Valera 3 had to have support life at one point.
Well, the best example, and this is where your comment about water is very interesting, being an essential part of life. I mean, here we have this completely new inorganic life form. It's very dependent upon water.
Mm-hmm.
And, as we learn more about Mars, it seems like, there is water
Mm-hmm.
on Mars, subsoil. There's, the geologic evidence of, some of the geologic patterns we see, that they were carved by flowing water and so
Mm-hmm.
forth. There's evidence that there's, hidden water on the moon.
Oh yeah, and there's speculation now that there's huge supplies of hidden water hidden under the surface of Mars too.
Right.
There,
Yes.
there was originally the theory of Mars that, like, there was, and I don't know the technical term for it, but essentially, at some point the atmosphere of Mars diminished so much that all the water was basically cooked off of the surface by
Right.
the
Yes.
radiation because of the
Yes.
loss of ozone. But that
Right.
might not be true. You actually may have had the water recede deeper into the soil, and maybe that is how life was wiped out. They were no longer able to access easily potable water. They would either have to dig into the ground or, you know, die of thirst.
Mm-hmm.
That may have happened if all of this water just sank to the ground. All life at some point, at least on the surface level of Mars, died out from the lack of.
And it gets into, if water is essential and the water, evaporated away, so that Mars was completely arid, then even if they had access to the energy from the sun, they had no energy flow into a surface ecosystem to support life, which
Mhm.
comes into question then, if one of the, you know, uh, exploratory robots we're putting on the surface Mars could really drill down, I mean, meters, I mean, even tens of meters or hundreds of meters
Mhm.
into the uh, the Martian crust, would they possibly find life there?
Yeah. Well, they.
Because one of the things we found is that there's a lot of underground microbial life that we
Mhm.
didn't expect.
Well, I believe they previously found dead microbial life on Mars.
They suspect it, but
Yeah.
I don't think it's been confirmed.
Okay. I think you're right. It may have been a suspicion, but there's
Right.
been no confirmation yet. But one thing that I think is often left out of the climate change conversation is that a lot of climate really is determined by atmospheric conditions.
Hmm.
Primarily by atmospheric conditions. One thing that I'm curious about Valera 3 is that it were they able to actually go outside the terraforming facility? Like, is there already an atmosphere with air or a nitrogen, or the Because it didn't seem like they could.
It didn't. I don't think it was specified at all. No.
So I'm very curious how they think they are going to reinitialize the atmosphere by just creating plant life. Because it seems to me like, one thing that you need to have life, and we've already kind of covered it, you need a sun or you need a star that could, and you need to be able to fall within a Goldilocks zone um, biogenic life, or maybe, well, it gets into the question of how does organic life come to be?
Well, it gets into the question is how does inorganic life come to be in this case?
Yeah, exactly. Um, so I think that Valera 3, if it's going to terraform, it needs to be in some sort of Goldilocks zone next to a star. So whatever plants are created on that planet, unless they've developed a sort of plant that can thrive without sunlight, and not a genetically altered plant that's purely nocturnal, which would be interesting. Um, but you need sun, you need water. I don't see there being a real plan to reinitialize or create an atmosphere beyond growing plants. And from what we know, you can't just. Unfortunately, even if we planted the entire Earth in new trees, in new tree growth, it still wouldn't be enough to clean the atmosphere entirely of all the carbon we've pumped into it.
No.
Um, I, I'm just curious what the Federation's idea is to get an atmosphere working here again.
There's just not enough information given to us. And, one of the things we could do is a side podcast, a sidebar podcast. We could go on to, Wikipedia and do some Google searches on the science of what is known about terraforming in theory now as to how that could happen.
That might be
But
something.
I don't think there's just not enough information from this episode or from the Star Trek universe to figure that out. But they're very valid and interesting questions that you're asking there. It's kind of like a chicken or egg thing.
Well, I think until we really explore, and I'm talking about the real world that we live in now, not Star Trek. Well, they've already done this in Star Trek, but I think until we actually achieve interstellar travel and are actually able, well, not even interstellar, interplanetary travel, and we're able to actually get to Mars and then get to Europa and then get to Titan, because those are the closest planets that have the possibility of life on them. Until we get there, it's, I think that we're forever going to be stuck with the chicken and egg question. I was listening to a lecture today. Ben and I were listening to a lecture today on Carl Sagan, or I was listening to it. But Carl Sagan was a big believer in extraterrestrial life and going out and finding extraterrestrial life. He was a big supporter of the SETI program.
Yes, he was. That's right.
For those of you who don't know, the SETI program is a search for extraterrestrial life, and I forget an intelligence.
Intelligence, yeah.
Yeah. Basically, there's a bunch of massive satellites here in the United States that are beaming radio signals into space, hoping that.
Well, they're radio telescopes. They're receivers also. More,
right.
Yeah.
The idea that we're going to beam signal into space, and somewhere someone will hear it and be like, "Hi," and send us back a hi, hopefully. Versus, I think Hawking had this worry that if we started sending these signals out into space, what if we attracted a hostile alien force? Which, is speculation for another thing. But one thing that I wanted to talk about is at the central of this discussion about the reconceptualization of life is the problem of a conflict resulting from the lack of an ability to communicate.
Yes.
And you brought up the 1952's The Day the Earth the Day the Earth Stood Still, which is a classic of science fiction, and Arrival from 2016, the Amy Adams movie, which is also very good.
Right.
And both of those movies deal with us meeting an alien force, and because of our inability to communicate, we become hostile towards each other in some way. I find it interesting that in home soil, there are things that seem to already be there to help Bean communicate. Like, for example, Geordi mentions in his visor when he looks upon the inorganic organism in the bell jar, he sees the light from the life form almost as music.
But
And
that was when they discovered it on the planet, when it was in
right,
that's when he said that he was, since he can see different wavelengths and so forth, that was interesting to me too, that he sensed seeing light as a form of music because of the pulsations and so on.
mm-hmm. And what is that Steven Spielberg movie? Something of the Third Kind. It's where
Oh, Close Encounters.
Close Encounters with the Third Kind.
Right.
At the end of that, when
Oh,
the aliens
yes.
come down, they communicate through
Yes.
music.
That's right.
So
Exactly.
it made me wonder, like, well, why didn't they try to communicate through music if Geordi had identified that these
Oh,
creatures
that's a
had
good
light
idea.
patterns?
Yeah, that's a good
Well,
idea. Yeah.
one thing, in kind of getting back to Sagan was really integral in. He's the one who recorded the Pioneer message and helped design the golden
Right.
discs that are on Voyager.
Right.
Like he was really the one who helped formulate the message that hopefully aliens will get. And one of the things about those golden discs is that they're full of mathematical equations.
Right.
Because the idea is that if we live in a universe that are bound by physical laws, be they gravity, thermodynamics, what have you, we know that mathematics is the language of the universe, that we can use math to determine the breadth of almost everything. It seems interesting to me that in our even back in the 80s, there was an understanding that if we had to talk to aliens or we met aliens, that we would use math as a way to not only help them understand our language but also decode theirs, and that we would use some sort of binary or numerical language to communicate with each other. Because if we live in a universe that is bound by the same laws, the same mathematical laws that we can prove through these equations, the hope is if we meet an extraterrestrial race that has developed something like light speed technology or faster than light technology to travel the stars, that they would have knowledge of these mathematical concepts as well.
Well,
And through that, we would be able
right.
to start a dialogue.
Well, it's very interesting because when I mentioned, you mentioned the day the Earth stood still. When Klaatu arrives in Washington, he knows English, so there's really not a communication problem. However, there's an interesting scene where with the little boy, they break into Professor Barnhart's house because he's supposed to be kind of like the Einstein in this story, and Klaatu looks at this, equation on Professor Barnhart's blackboard. It has something to do with celestial navigation or something like that. And Klaatu shakes his head and says, "You're so dumb." And he writes on the board and, makes it known that he was the one that does it, where Professor Barnhart can find him. And he comes back, the military brings Klaatu, not knowing who he is, back to Professor Barnhart's home. And that's when Klaatu reveals who he is, because he said, "Well, I don't understand. This is right. I've been trying to solve this equation for months. But was it practical?" He says, "Well, I've used it to navigate, between the planets." And then Barnhart knows that Klaatu is the guy from the ship. So again, mathematics are key to communication. The other thing in Arrival, that really is a very interesting movie because if first of all, because there was an inability to communicate, there was pending hostility with the aliens, and there was geopolitical hostility particularly between China and the US and so on. And if you remember the way those aliens communicated, they had their language was very visual in pattern, and it was there was a mathematics to those symbols. And Amy Adams, as a linguist, figured out what the symbology of their language was, which was very complex. And then the other one that I didn't think of until you mentioned it, trying to communicate with lights, like it was in, which is kind of related to the lights being related to music, as it was in the contact scene in Close Encounters of the Third Kind. You had communication, but of a bad type, using lights when the helicopters were in Washington during what's the movie? Independence Day in 1996. And the helicopters flashed the lights, figured they could communicate with the aliens, and the aliens say, "Guess what? We're going to tell you we're not here to be friendly." And they shoot the helicopters down.
Mm-hmm.
So, but that's an example of an attempt to communicate where there's no communication and hostility that triggered the hostility, and then the president knows that we're in big trouble.
And it should be noted that when it comes to home soil, the way they ultimately come to a recognition that these hostilities have to end is that things ramp up to the point where Picard's like, okay, dim the lights. Because we know if they're photoelectric, removing the lights will kill them. And even the microbrain says, you're killing us, you're killing us, you're killing
Right,
us. And
right.
Picard immediately says, turn the lights back up. We don't want to kill you. We don't want to do this to you. Troy even goes as
Right.
far as to say, you are beautiful to us.
Yes.
It seems, I think one of the reasons why things don't ultimately go to terrible shit in this episode is because at the last moment, the notion of mercy, which is probably something very foreign to this inorganic life, probably is what saves the potential future relationship between humans and this inorganic life form. Just the human notion of mercy.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's something in this story that, even though we lack communication sometimes, when we finally get it, the thing that ultimately ends up bringing us to peace is the ability for us to recognize someone in need or someone in trouble, and we decide to be kind to them first above all other things. I think that's really the moral of the story, is that if we get into these kind of situations, these first contact situations, and we make these mistakes, we not only have to own them, and this kind of gets into the conversation about colonialism. We not only have to own them, we kind of have to rectify them with kindness.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a very compelling point that this story tries to make when it comes to the interaction between life forms. We share a lot of things in terms of hostilities and wanting to protect ourselves and, fulfill our own innate selfish desires. But the thing that ultimately draws us to seeing, I guess, a oneness in each other or a similarity in each other is the fact that we have the ability to be merciful and be kind. I think that's. Oh, sorry.
That's a really good observation, because it just made me think of this is nothing to do with contact between alien species, but there was no mercy on the Germans after World War One, which directly created the petri dish for fascism and Hitler,
Mm-hmm.
and resulted in World War II.
Mm-hmm.
And then if you can compare it to what happened in Japan after they surrendered,
Mm-hmm.
and what MacArthur did to put them back on their feet, to really introduce a demilitarized democratic form of government, which he was successful and this country was successful in doing. And in the same way, with good political motivation, because of the conflict that had started with the Soviet Union and the spread of communism, what the Marshall Plan did to rebuild Europe, including Germany.
Mm-hmm.
It was very much mercy it was very much what Lincoln wanted to do with the South after the Civil War. Let them up easy. Let's rebuild them. We're going to welcome them back. Again, mercy.
We should also remember that Lincoln wanted to send all the slaves back to Africa too.
Yeah, but I think he realized that that wasn't going to happen because didn't he and Sherman and Grant figured that they were going to give? I think it was Sherman's. Well, maybe Lincoln did want to do that because Sherman wanted to give them all 40 acres.
Yeah. Oh well, Sherman was like Sherman's one of the strangest progressives in history in many
Yes,
ways.
right,
Like on one hand,
right,
very progressive individual. On the other hand, burned the South down.
right.
Like,
Scorched earth. War is hell.
where was Sherman from, by the way? I forget off the
I
top
think
of
he
it.
was from. I know that he retired to Boston. I think he was from Massachusetts.
Okay, because he was a northerner. Yeah.
Yes.
So let's let's cover a few more points because I think we've covered most of the
Yeah.
episode here.
Yeah.
It's very interesting how the crew of the Enterprise goes about solving the mystery because on one hand they have Troy there who automatically knows that Mandel can't be trusted because she is an empath because of her Betazoid heritage. So she can tell who cannot be trusted. But there's one interesting fact where she knows that Louisa has an attraction to Riker. And she makes the suggestion that Riker should be the one to go in and, lightly interrogate Louisa to why to figure out what happened. And she even goes on to kind of like psychologically profile each and every one of them. And it's a very interesting scene because it could be argued quite easily that Troy here is conducting a manipulation of everyone to solve this mystery using
I
her
had that.
power in a
I
way.
had a little. Yeah, I had sort of had that thought too.
And
Yeah.
it is just an interesting turn for her character. I know that sending Riker to charm a woman is not surprising, but the fact that it came from Troy and Troy's like, no, send him, is I think is a very interesting thing that most people miss in these episodes. Because sometimes it feels like Troy isn't a very proactive character. She's just there to fill in things. But this is a very unique scenario where Troy's kind of like conducting her own investigation. Uh, let's see, what else? We have some. Oh, I find it interesting how all the terraformers react to life because we've already talked about how Mandel probably knew there was intelligent life there, so he's definitely guilty of killing these things. Bjorn is very, very sorry and very, very regretful, and so is Louisa. But Louisa has this weird kind of affectation where she's more sad. She's sad and ashamed that this inorganic organism it has been harmed, but she's also said that she's not going to see the terraforming be completed. And I think that's just saying so much about the strange duality of humans, Because on one hand, I think it's weird. It's understandable that we want to see our things come to fruition, but but still wanting that, even though we know we've caused drastic harm to something, she's a very complex. I almost found her to be slightly disturbed character. Not disturbed. Like she doesn't always seem to be there, And even Troy says that she has like the personality of a dreamer. Like she's very high on concepts and ideas, but when it comes to like the finer things, she's not necessarily the person you go to. There's other people on her team for that.
I think it presents a conundrum, and Mandel had this, but and Louisa did too. Is they had put so much into it, and the scenario is if someone puts so much into a project, and then they come to realize that it's not going to come to fruition, there is, it can be a great sense of loss. Um, you know, loss of time. You just feel like all the energy and dedication they put into it is is going to waste.
Yeah.
And there's there's sadness with that. It's sort of a personal tragedy and so forth. So Louisa, being a much more emotional person, and not to be misogynistic, but it's sort of her, you know, she's somewhat of an emotional woman. Again, it gets back to Troy saying that she's a dreamer. She kind of set herself up for not feeling well when she realized that what they were doing,
I
it
don't think it's
wasn't going to
misogynistic to
work.
say that, because like it's not misogyn. I don't think it's very misogynistic to say that, just because Troy takes advantage of that.
Well, I don't want to be, I'm,
No, I know.
I'm saying, I'm being a little prejudicial that women are saying that women are perhaps more emotional than men.
Yeah.
And there's a little bit of that there, the way she is portrayed.
That's true. Well, I think in some ways, like, I think it's very hard to portray some of these very complex scenes when, if you don't have experience with this, and especially on a scale like this, where you've put so much in your life to the idea that you can transform the dead into the living again. It's almost getting back to, we had a conversation a few episodes back about Victor Frankenstein. Oh, Datalore. In many
Mhm.
ways, it's kind of like Frankenstein all over again, where you've tried to create something that you thought was going to be beneficial, but in the end, it turned into a disaster. And then having to deal with, in many ways, Mandel and Luis are very much each kind of like a different formulation of Victor Frankenstein. Because on one hand, you have Mandel, who's just so committed to the idea that what he's doing is right, he can't see the monster he's become. Where, you have, and in Shelley's novel, Victor Frankenstein goes through that transformation where he can't see the monster that he's become in creating that monster, versus
Mhm.
Louisa, who isn't a monster,
No.
but she is so driven that she can't put that drive to the side until she sees the cost of it.
Mhm.
And just like for Victor Frankenstein, it haunts her. So I think there's a very interesting connection to Frankenstein in the story
Hmm.
that
Hmm.
I don't think I realized until we really started talking about this. In terms of ambition, is such a difficult thing in many ways, because I don't think most people, and this may be me being prejudicial, I think most people have been taught that the greatest ambition you could have is a home, a marriage, kids, the typical American dream. But there isn't, I don't think we as humans or society have really come up with a way to deal with individuals who are so driven, who are so forceful in their vision that they can put aside morality and ethics for it. And I think that we're dealing with that now in the modern world when it comes to kind of the billionaire class, in terms of, you have all these people who say they're doing altruistic things, but in the process of saying these altruistic things, many of them are making their billions off of the exploitation of the earth, its peoples, and its governments. So there's a very, and I think we don't have the language or necessarily the skills to negotiate that yet, because we've come up, ambition in our head always creates scenarios where we're successful,
Mhm.
because that's the hope we go into, that we're going to be successful.
Mhm.
It rarely leaves room for, or we're taught rarely to leave room for self-reflection and self-criticism, which are two very important things in terms of developing a very, not only a healthy human personality, but developing the mentality and the skill set you need to actually go and pursue your goals. Like,
Mhm.
if you're going to actually be successful at something, you need to be ready to fail, or you need to at least have the idea in your head that you can fail. And it seems here with Louisa and Mandel, failure just never entered their mind that this project would not succeed. And it really is the hubris of it that I think is the cause of their ultimate downfall and ultimately the conflict. Because I think the hard thing that when we're talking about colonialism, we're talking about sexism, we're talking about gender discrimination and all this stuff, a lot of it comes from the hubris of believing the superiority of one idea or one set of ideas or a person over another. And I think the maybe our great human flaw that we've yet to really deal with on a sincere level is our hubris.
I think you're hitting the nail on the head because in what you just said before is that, um, you know, it's related to pride in, what someone does, what they dedicate themselves to, particularly if they define what they're doing as an altruistic goal, and they can get so into it, they can um, become hubristic. And what you said is key is that they don't stop regularly and self-assess,
Yes.
then the hubris goes out of control. And that point, it really becomes that individual's tragic flaw.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think our actually it's very interesting. It's a Persian flaw because Picard's Persian flaw, and I forget which episode. It's when Riker has a beard. So it's season 2, because that's when Will Riker gets a beard, folks. There's one point where I forget what the mission is, but Riker brings up that Picard's Persian flaw is that he can't just sit there and wait for something to happen. He has to make a decision. He has to lead. He can't sit there and simply wait for the information to come to him. And much of that is Picard's hubris. Like, Picard can't let go of how he thinks things work for him and how to get what he needs from whatever method he goes about things in terms of his leadership as a captain. But it really is like Riker's pointing out, like, it's your hubris that's stopping you from figuring this out. It's your inability to stop. And on that note, I think we're going to end this episode tonight. Before we go, just one last time, Dad, what did you think of Home Soil? And in terms of where you see it in this season, do you think it's one of the better episodes, one of the worst episodes? Do you think is the show still getting better?
I think it's just a good, again, a good story episode. I don't think um, I wouldn't say it's a great episode. I'd give it a, for letter grade, I'd give it a B, a solid B.
Yeah, me too. I think that's a
Yeah.
good one.
Yeah.
So on that, we will shut down for tonight, folks. Thank you for joining us, Dad. Thank you so much. We'll see you all next time for Star Trek: The Next Generation, Season 1, Episode 18, which is Coming of Age.
Yes.
So thank you, everyone.
Okay.
Thank you for joining us. See you later, Dad.
Bye-bye, Jay.